Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Ask Windows Central, where we take your questions. This week we'll be talking about the M1 Max, also a little bit about Surface Neo, will it ever come out, and whatever happened to Windows Core OS. All that and more. Stay tuned.
So first question, I think this one's pretty funny. Do you think us Windows users should have an inferiority complex in the context of M1 Max? Dan, I think you should take this one away.
So, yeah, I have so much to say on this, and it'll probably take up a whole video. I'll try to keep it brief. Obviously, the M1 Max, the Pro, the M1 processor itself has made a lot of inways and had a huge impact on discussions of computers in 2020 and 2021, and for good reason, right? It is one of the first major advancements we've seen in processing power for laptops, matched with efficiency, which is kind of really the bigger story here. Should Windows users have an inferiority complex? I don't think so, or rather, it really depends on what you use your computer for. I've gone on the podcast often and said, I use the Surface Pro X as my main device when I'm not in front of a desktop, and I'm very happy with the performance of it for my needs. That's what I use it for. I don't game a lot. I need it for basic things, and the form factor is what drives my enjoyment of that device. And that's sort of the big story for me when it comes to Windows PCs. It's the form factor and choice that users have, whether that means price points. Not everybody can afford a $3,000 laptop, so you can get a really good $800 one running an AMD processor and still have a very good experience. Or you can get a 2-in-1 form factor that converts into a tablet. You can get Windows on ARM, you can get 5G, you get pen and inking. All that is not available when it comes to Macs. But when we just talk about the processor, sure, who wouldn't want that? I've always joked about this on the podcast that I've yet to run a computer that I've said was, whoa, too fast and it had too much battery power. Literally never happened, never will happen either. But this is also good news because we're going to see a lot of innovation in processors over the next 2 to 3 years. Intel's 12th gen is looking very promising. It has an all-new architecture, similar to what ARM is with Big Little. They call them P and E cores, which is interesting. AMD is still there, doing a lot of really interesting stuff. You have Qualcomm, of course, who bought Nuvia, the very company that's run by people who developed Apple's own chips. That's a huge story. Qualcomm has gone on record saying they can beat Nuvia. They can actually beat Apple at its own game. We'll have to wait and see. And then you have Nvidia, who's buying ARM and wants to mix it with its RTX graphics. So you may be a little envious right now, and that's totally fine. We'll see the market catch up, I believe, in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe in the next year or so, and you're going to see this back and forth. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch if you're into computers in general, so stay tuned. Don't worry, though. You don't need to be depressed over this stuff. It's all good news for the industry.
I'm also a firm believer in, if you're not a fan of Mac OS, these chips are never going to do anything for you, right? Because you have to enjoy the platform really to take advantage of the hardware. And if you don't enjoy the OS, then you're not really going to be interested in buying a Mac at all, right? No matter how powerful the chips are.
Absolutely. And, Apple just released its financials. It saw a 2% increase in revenue for MacBooks over the last quarter. That's running the M1 processor, right? So the impact hasn't been that big for Apple. They're getting a lot of churn. A lot of people are buying Macs who, already had a Mac. And you're getting a few people who are buying new for the first time, but we're not seeing a tidal wave switching over. And while those new Macs weren't counted, those new Macs are super expensive. Again, $2,500, $3,500 for those laptops, meaning the volume of sales is going to be even lower for those. So I don't think the impact is going to be as big as people expect it to be, but it is good news for the industry. All right, so here's a great question for Zach. What happened to Windows Core OS? Did the project get canceled, or was it rolled into Windows 11?
Boy, where do I begin with this one? So, for a quick backstory, I guess, Windows Core OS was at one point considered the future of Windows internally at Microsoft. It was this sort of rethinking of the Windows core of OS, essentially. They rebuilt the core with modern technologies, they made it modular, and they positioned it as a sort of UWP native OS. They started work on this over 5 years ago at this point, and to this day we've not really seen it ship in any meaningful capacity. Windows Core has shipped in some products. It ships in HoloLens 2. It was supposed to ship on the Surface Neo and Surface Hub 2X. Those products were unfortunately cancelled. So yes, HoloLens 2 is the only product that actually ships with Windows Core OS installed today. There is also a factory OS image that developers and OEMs can use, which is technically Windows Core OS, but it's not a consumer-facing version at all. So yeah, what is happening with Windows Core OS? Well, I think it's fair to say that it's no longer considered the future of Windows. Microsoft has sort of refocused its efforts on classic Windows, Windows Desktop, which is what Windows 11 is based on. I do believe that over time, Microsoft will essentially roll in some of the Windows Core platform enhancements into Windows Classic and Windows 11, essentially turning it into a hybrid Windows Core, Windows Classic product. But as of right now, Windows 11 only really features the UX side that was being built on Windows Core. If you remember Windows 10X, that was a Windows Core product. And if you compare Windows 10X with Windows 11, the UIs are very similar, and that's not a coincidence. So over time, we are certainly going to see more and more of those Windows Core visions rolled into the classic version of Windows. And that includes some of the platform enhancements, such as faster Windows updates, containerized Win32 applications, and state-separated OS images and whatnot. For those, if you don't know what any of that means, look it up. Microsoft has detailed a number of this stuff before, especially back when Windows 10X was first announced. So they have detailed this stuff, and that will eventually come to Windows Desktop. It's just going to take time, because the reason Windows Core existed to begin with was because it was easier to do all of that stuff by rebuilding the OS from the ground up with modern tech. This time they're going at it the other way. They're trying to bring that stuff to the old code base, and that just takes a lot more time. But I do believe it's something they want to do eventually. So yeah, Windows Core is essentially being rolled into Windows 11 over time. They will become a hybrid of the two. And that should also improve things like system performance on low-end hardware. It can make the image smaller, depending on the kind of version of Windows 11 they're trying to build. But that's all stuff coming in the future. So on the subject of Windows Core OS, I guess this is kind of fitting. Will the Surface Neo ever be released? Go on, Dan. I think you should take this one.
This is probably the number one question we're asked all the time. And we should point out that this is a changing story. It's a fluid story. So what we say today may not hold in 6 months or a year from now. We don't know. Just keep that in mind. As of now, from Zach's sources, there are no plans to release Surface Neo. That is nothing immediate, nothing next year. We don't expect it in the next 2 years either. That could change. Going back to the history of this project, sure, there's Courier, but in between there was also Intel, who was leading this sort of initiative to reinvest in the 2-in-1 concept, to sort of spice it up again. We've already kind of landed on the 2-in-1 form factor, that is Surface Pro and other 360 devices. But what's next? So Intel had this idea that, well, what about dual screen type of PCs or even folding displays, right? And so it was an industry-led initiative. Dell was on board with this. HP probably had something working. Lenovo actually released something. And of course, Microsoft had Surface Neo. This all got put on hold once COVID happened. And what changed was the demand for traditional PCs. So out of this came Windows 11 and a refocus on current desktop experience, including all-in-one desktops, which have grown substantially as well. And that's where Microsoft is focusing right now, because that's where the market is. It's saying we need just traditional, regular laptops. This is not the time to invest money in what is a niche and experimental device. I'm one of these people that's actually skeptical of Surface Neo. I get it looks cool. I've actually handled the device previously. I'm not 100% convinced it's going to be good, okay? Part of that's because Windows 10X doesn't exist anymore, right? We don't have that. So the operating system is not optimized for that experience. But even if it was, there are still questions about how usable it will be, including using the keyboard, whether the physical one or the on-screen one. And so I think there's a lot of questions. It may be useful. I want to see it released because I want to see it go into the market and see what people say about it, and then see it evolve. But I think it's a very niche case right now, and they're very expensive. We didn't expect that device to go, for at least $2,000. Not a lot of people are going to buy it. And when you look at Surface Duo, you still have a lot of questions about its usability, which I disagree with. I'm a huge fan of Duo. But if you look at the market itself, it questions its value. You would see that as well for Neo. But that's a long answer. I do think Microsoft will return to this in a couple of years when it can reallocate resources and start to focus on next-gen devices. But do not expect this device to come out anytime soon.
It's also important to remember that the Neo that was announced was hit with a number of setbacks almost immediately, starting with the delay of Windows 10X and ultimately the cancellation of Windows 10X. You know, the Neo was then left without an OS. So then you ask, well, why couldn't they just put Windows 11 on it? They could, but they need to optimize Windows 11 for that dual screen setup. It's not as simple as just installing Windows 11 and then leaving it to the OS to just see two displays and treat it as so. That's not really how it works with Surface Neo. There were lots of optimizations to the snapping UI and stuff that made sense for a dual screen device like Surface Neo. But in addition to that, Intel cancelled its Lakefield series of chips, which is what was going to power the Surface Neo as well. So not only does the Neo no longer have an OS, it also doesn't have a chipset. So any engineering they did with the Surface Neo up until that point needs to sort of be redone with a different chip, whether that be Intel or ARM going forward. We don't know if they ever decide to even come back to this form factor. But there was a lot of setbacks for the Surface Neo. So that's another reason why we haven't seen it and likely won't see it for many years to come because, well, there's a lot of components to that product missing at this point.
All right, here's a question for Zach. What is the point of the beta ring? Since it doesn't see a ton of updates, what exactly is its role?
So with the Windows Insider program, there are three different channels, essentially. There's the dev channel, there's the beta channel, and there's the release preview channel. The dev channel is the top level, which is the one that gets the sort of ongoing feature set that may or may not ship. The beta channel is for, even though it's called beta, it's kind of not really for beta. It is towards the end, but we'll talk a bit about that. But you can look at the beta channel as a channel more for almost finished products and apps and services and stuff. So the dev channels for the stuff that's in development, like active development. The beta channels for stuff that they intend to ship, and then the release preview channel right now is in a weird position. It's more for Windows 10 since Windows 11 is now a thing. The release preview channel is for Microsoft to continue testing Windows 10 updates with PCs that aren't eligible for Windows 11, but I eventually over time I assume the release preview channel will return to its initial sort of, this is the ring that we push to 2 or so weeks before the next major feature release goes out, and that's essentially supposed to be the final version, the actual complete code that they're just testing before they hit send to the production channel. But the beta channel specifically does feel like it's dormant for most of the year, and that's because it doesn't really come into play until towards the end of a development cycle, because that's when Microsoft begins sort of forking its code into a release branch, and that's when they begin shaping a product with the correct feature set and the branding and so on and so forth, and that's when the beta channel comes into play. So you know, with Windows 11, we saw Windows 11 come to the beta channel, and a lot of the beta testing for Windows 11 happened within dev and beta at the same time. But now dev has moved on, beta's sort of been left behind, and that will sort of remain the case up until sort of next spring when Microsoft begins finalizing the next version of Windows 11, at which point Microsoft will begin sending out builds to the base channel again, which will have basically a complete feature set and a complete shape of what the next version will look like. But it's still not done. There's still like a few weeks of development left. They're just fixing up bugs and so on and so forth. So that's what the beta channel's for. Most of the year, it lays dormant. You get app updates early and maybe driver updates, but for the most part, in regards to the actual OS, it doesn't get too much. The dev channel is where you want to be if you want, access to rolling features and changes on a weekly basis. But that can also be at the cost of stability, which some people may not like.
All right, so that does it for this episode of Ask Windows Central. Remember, if you have a question, hit us up on Twitter with Ask Windows Central as the hashtag, or drop me an email at daniel@windowscentral.com. Just put Ask Windows Central into the subject line, and we'll see about answering your question. As always, follow us on Twitter, and we look forward to the next episode. Take care, everyone.